There's a monkey experiment involving a wire mother and a cloth mother that basically wrecks Freud's theory of why you pick the partners you pick. Stick around, the last finding might actually let you off the hook. The way you handle conflict with a partner might trace back to how your mother or father answered your cries as a baby. Psychologists Cindy Hazan and Philip Shaver found in 1987 that adults sort into the same attachment categories infants show with caregivers: secure, anxious, or avoidant. Someone who was securely attached as a child tends to trust that a partner will come back after a fight. Someone who is anxiously attached tends to panic over a slow reply to a text. The pattern isn't fixed for life, but it shows up again and again in how adults handle closeness. That's why a good couples therapist asks about your childhood before they ask about your marriage. Here's the twist: the attachment style you had as an infant does not lock you into the same style as an adult. Chris Fraley's 2002 meta-analysis pooled decades of longitudinal studies and found only moderate stability, correlations hovering around 0.2 to 0.5 depending on how attachment was measured. That means plenty of anxiously attached toddlers grow into secure adults, and plenty of securely attached toddlers don't. Think about the friend who grew up in a chaotic home but somehow built the calmest marriage you know. A new stable relationship, therapy, or even a supportive friendship can shift the pattern, which undercuts the idea that childhood is a life sentence for how you love. Watch how a couple acts right before one of them goes through airport security, and you can predict their attachment style. Psychologists Jeffrey Simpson, William Rholes, and Julia Nelligan filmed dating couples in an airport waiting area before one partner left on a stressful flight in a 1992 study. Women who reported high anxiety sought more comfort from their partner the more scared they were, but avoidant women pulled away and sought less comfort exactly when they needed it most. The mismatch matched each person's self-reported attachment style almost perfectly. It's a live demonstration of a habit formed in childhood. Some people reach for comfort under stress, others brace and go it alone. In the 1950s, psychologist Harlow raised baby monkeys with two fake mothers, one made of bare wire that dispensed milk, and one made of soft cloth that dispensed nothing. The infant monkeys spent almost all their time clinging to the cloth mother and only visited the wire one to feed. Harlow's 1958 study overturned the idea that babies bond with caregivers purely because they provide food. What the monkeys wanted was contact, warmth, something soft to hold on to when they were scared. That single finding reshaped how psychologists think about human infants too, and it's part of why we now believe a cold, efficient childhood can leave adults hungry for touch they can't quite name. You've probably heard that people unconsciously pick partners just like their parents. The theory even has a name, repetition compulsion, coined by Sigmund Freud. It's a great story. You grew up with a distant father, so you keep dating distant men, replaying the same wound hoping to finally win. The problem is that decades of research have never produced solid evidence that people systematically choose partners who resemble their parents in personality or behavior. What does hold up is something less dramatic. People raised in inconsistent or harsh homes tend to tolerate more conflict and instability in adult relationships than people who weren't. So the pattern is real, it's just simpler and less mystical than the Freudian version. Here's an uncomfortable one: if your parents divorced, you're statistically more likely to divorce too. Amato and DeBoer tracked this in 2001 and found offspring of divorced parents faced roughly double the odds of their own marriage ending. It's not really about learning to fight, it's about weaker belief in permanence. Kids who watched a marriage end once tend to see divorce as an exit option rather than a last resort, so they bail earlier when things get hard. Picture two couples hitting the exact same rough patch, one treats it as solvable, the other starts packing boxes. That difference in belief, not literal conflict, is doing the work. It matters because the pattern gets passed through expectations, not genes. Growing up without a dad around can quietly speed up your biological clock. Belsky, Steinberg, and Draper proposed in 1991 that harsh or unpredictable early childhoods push kids toward an evolutionary shortcut: reproduce sooner, invest less per relationship. Ellis and colleagues tested this in 1999, following girls from kindergarten through adolescence, and found earlier father absence predicted earlier first periods and more short-term relationship patterns later on. The effect size was modest, and later replications have been inconsistent, so treat this as a real but shaky pattern, not a rule. Think of it as a body reading its environment as unstable and adjusting strategy accordingly. It matters because it reframes so-called commitment issues as possibly calibrated, not simply broken. You can have a rough childhood and still raise a securely attached kid, if you can tell the story straight. Main and Goldwyn's adult attachment interview research in the mid-1980s found something called earned security, adults who describe painful childhoods with coherence and reflection, rather than confusion or denial, parent just as securely as people who had genuinely happy ones. Pearson and colleagues confirmed this pattern in 1994. Picture someone calmly explaining that their mother was cold but they understand why, versus someone insisting their childhood was perfect while contradicting themselves mid-sentence. It's the coherence of the narrative, not the literal history, that predicts the outcome. That matters because it means the story you tell about your past may outweigh the past itself. Kids who grow up watching their parents fight don't just remember it, their bodies keep reacting to it for years. Cummings and Davies' emotional security theory, tested through the 1990s and 2000s, found children exposed to harsh interparental conflict show heightened heart rate and cortisol responses to conflict cues well into adulthood. The theory holds that a child's sense of safety is built on the parent's relationship, so instability there recalibrates how threatening any conflict feels later. Someone who grew up in that house might feel their pulse spike over a partner's raised eyebrow, while someone else barely notices. That matters because the reaction feels like overreacting to a partner, when it's really an old alarm system still running. Everything you think you remember about your own childhood might be less reliable than you assume. Hart and Rutter's 2004 review pooled studies comparing people's later recollections of childhood adversity against records taken at the time, and found only moderate agreement between the two. People forget mild neglect, exaggerate isolated incidents, or reinterpret entire relationships once their current mood or relationship shifts. Someone freshly heartbroken tends to recall their parents' marriage as worse than they described it years earlier. That matters for every claim in this video and every one you'll hear elsewhere. Childhood isn't a fixed file being read back, it's a story that keeps getting rewritten by the present. Here's a number that predicts more about your love life than your zodiac sign. It's called your ACE score. Vincent Felitti and colleagues surveyed over 17,000 adults in 1998, counting childhood adversities like abuse, neglect, or a parent's addiction. People with 4 or more of these were far more likely to end up in relationships marked by intimate partner violence or repeated divorce than people with none. The study never pinned down the exact mechanism, researchers still argue about the pathway. Picture a kid who grew up walking on eggshells around an unpredictable parent, that same hypervigilance can quietly follow them into a marriage decades later. It's why, just get over your childhood is such bad advice. Growing up broke doesn't just shape your bank account, it shapes how you fight with your partner. Rand Conger's family stress model, tested on farm families in the 1990s and followed into the next generation by 2000, tracked kids whose parents faced economic hardship. Money pressure made parents harsher and more withdrawn with each other, and the kids were watching. Decades later, those same children showed lower warmth and more hostility in their own romantic relationships, even after accounting for their adult income. Think of a teenager who watched parents snap over unpaid bills, that's a conflict style getting rehearsed for later. Poverty gets remembered less as numbers and more as a relationship template. Divorce isn't actually the villain here, conflict is. Paul Amato and Alan Booth followed over 2,000 married adults across 17 years starting in 1980 and found that growing up with parents who fought bitterly, whether or not they eventually split, predicted worse marital quality in their kids as adults. Couples who stayed together but constantly clashed passed on the same relationship troubles as the ones who divorced. Picture two households, one with quiet, respectful disagreements, another with slammed doors and silent treatment, only the second leaves a mark. It suggests kids aren't just learning about commitment from their parents, they're learning how to argue, and that lesson outlasts the marriage itself. You've probably heard that firstborns are bossy and lastborns are rebels, ready to explain your whole relationship style. Julia Rohrer and colleagues tested this in 2015 using data from over 20,000 people across Germany, the UK, and the US. They found no meaningful effect of birth order on personality traits like extroversion or emotional stability, the traits that actually predict how you behave in relationships. The popular theory, made famous by Frank Sulloway in 1996, mostly relied on smaller studies comparing siblings from different families, which let in all sorts of confounds. So if your partner blames their controlling streak on being the oldest child, the data doesn't back them up. Birth order makes a great story, not a great predictor. Selma Freyberg had a name for something therapists kept noticing in the 1970s, ghosts in the nursery. Working with troubled mother-infant pairs, she described parents who swore they'd never repeat their own parents' mistakes, then found themselves snapping in eerily identical ways during moments of stress. A mother slapped as a toddler might feel a sudden, unexplained urge to slap her own crying baby, with no memory of choosing to. Freiberg's work was based on clinical case studies, not controlled trials, so nobody's proven exactly why old trauma resurfaces this way. It's a reminder that the relationships you're most sure you've escaped are often the ones quietly directing you. Picture a toddler raised in a Romanian orphanage in the 1980s, with almost no one holding or talking to them for months at a stretch. When British researchers followed these children after they were adopted into stable, loving homes, many still struggled decades later to form close adult relationships, showing patterns like indiscriminate friendliness or trouble trusting a partner. The effect held even when kids left the institution as toddlers and had every material need met afterward. Some researchers think there's a narrow early window for learning how relationships work, and once it passes, catching up gets much harder, though that idea isn't proven. This matters because it suggests early relational input, not just food and shelter, shapes how you connect with people for life. Here's something that surprises most people: the classic attachment categories we treat as universal don't hold together as neatly across cultures as you'd think. When researchers pooled data from 8 countries in 1988, they found more variation in attachment styles between families within the same culture than between different cultures entirely. A German toddler and a Japanese toddler weren't reliably more different from each other than 2 toddlers from the same neighborhood. That undercuts the idea that one culture's parenting style produces one national attachment type. It matters because it means your specific upbringing, not your country's parenting norms, is what shaped how you love as an adult. It turns out your baby attachment style probably isn't what shapes your adult love life directly. Your childhood friendships are the real bridge. The Minnesota longitudinal study tracked children from infancy into their 30s and found secure attachment as a baby predicted better friendships in grade school, which predicted more competent teenage relationships, which predicted healthier romantic relationships as an adult. Skip a step, like having no close friends in elementary school, and the chain weakens no matter how secure your infancy was. Think of a kid who was close with mom but got isolated at school. That middle chapter matters more than people assume. Relationship skill gets built cumulatively, one stage at a time, not fixed at birth. Some kids grow up managing a parent's emotions instead of the other way around, comforting a depressed mom, mediating parents' fights, acting like a mini-adult by age 9. Therapists call this parentification, and the pattern that tends to follow these kids into adulthood is overfunctioning in relationships, doing all the emotional labor, struggling to ask a partner for help. The evidence here is thinner than you'd expect. Most of it comes from small clinical samples and self-report surveys rather than large controlled studies, so treat it as a real but unconfirmed pattern. Picture someone who can't relax on a date because they're too busy managing everyone else's mood. Being the responsible one as a kid isn't always the compliment it sounds like. A child who watches their parents hit each other is measurably more likely to end up in a violent relationship themselves, and the pattern holds for both perpetration and being a victim. A study following over 500 families for 2 decades found exposure to interparental physical violence in childhood predicted higher rates of partner violence in the child's own relationships 20 years later. The likely mechanism is social learning. Kids absorb conflict as a usable tool for handling anger simply because it's the only model they've seen up close. Think of a boy who watched his father shove his mother during arguments, then finds himself doing something similar under stress with his own partner. Conflict style, not just love style, gets passed down. Do you think you're anxious, avoidant, or secure, and does it match how your parents loved each other?